For this webinar. Um, I think there'll be people that'll be flowing in and out as we move forward. So you might have a few colleagues joining and leaving. Um, I'm very excited to be here today. I'm a social and political psychologist. I'm also a CAFE fellow at the Center of Academic and Faculty Excellence here at Claremont Graduate University. And I'm really passionate about sort of intergenerational knowledge transmission. I feel there's a lot that we learn but not enough that gets passed on in some ways. And then we sort of make the same mistakes, whether it's in education, whether it's in innovation, or any other field. So I'm very passionate about education as a mode of continuing sort of generational knowledge, and hopefully having a butterfly effect, meaning a much larger sort of change um, in the future. And that could be a behavioral outcome, it could be an attitude, but whatever it is, I believe that that change will come. Um, and so just along those lines is why I prepared and proposed this webinar for today, which is on the ethical use of AI in the classroom. Um, and this is sort of an exploration. I'm going to say this is going to be more of a co-creative process where I want to know your thoughts. I want to hear how you feel about it because ultimately it's all of us that are deciding the future of the use of AI in education. For those of you that are educators, this is a crux time where we need to make decisions, right? What are we going to do? Are we actually going to do something about it? Are we going to ignore it? How are we going to move forward with this, right? Um, a lot of us are skeptical about it. I've been a huge skeptic, but I do believe that it's my sort of responsibility as an educator to consider these options for whatever can, I guess, improve student outcome in that sense. And that's why I've titled today's sort of webinar on the ethical use of AI. Is this an oxymoron? This was a term growing up which was very popular in India, an oxymoron where you contradict yourself kind of within the same term. And so the ethical use of AI, I think, is pretty funny because it's like almost ironical, right? Can ethics and AI even exist in one conversation? And so I want to start off by sort of going over, sorry, my slides are not moving. Yeah. So I want to hear your thoughts on what you feel. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word ethics, right? Or ethics in the classroom. Let's sort of revisit the fundamentals of what ethics really means. So what is the first one word, two words, or three words that come to mind when you think about ethics? I would like you all to type it out in the chat box, but not press enter. I'm going to give you a few minutes to just type it out and have it ready. And then when I say enter in a few minutes, I would like you all to sort of post it at the same time so we can see a chat burst of ethics. Um, so yeah, take a couple of minutes, think about a few words that come to mind when you think about ethics in the classroom. Okay, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so for us to wrap up our thoughts. Okay, let's press enter. Amazing. I love this so much because you get to see all responses at once. So I'm just going to read out a few that I see in the chat. From Brock, structure and metabolic bandwidth. From Maggie, integrity, fairness, equity, competency. From Joshua, honesty, beneficence, transparency. Stephanie, right, correct. integrity, anti-plagiarism. From Jessica, we have best practices and guidance. From Marcelo, accountability, transparency, and ownership. From Randall, cheating. This covers everything. From V, integrity and consideration for time and place from Elizabeth, and utility in learning from Adam. Thank you all for sharing this. It's important for us to revisit the fundamental of ethics to see whether it still exists in the same way that we perceive it within our classrooms, right? And pointing out to a lot of the things that you all actually highlighted in this exercise, here are some common sort of ethical considerations that we have in the classroom, right? This is nothing new. This is like basics, kind of. So there's this sort of attitude of care or this ethic of care, the idea of responsibility and accountability, where we as educators are held accountable in many ways for what goes on within the classroom. Then the idea of transparency and flexibility. This is something that we consciously try to make assessments and assignments as flexible as possible, allow different modalities for submission. So these are all sort of ethical considerations that we already use and that are almost ingrained within us now that some of you have been educators for a while or some of you are just starting out. But even in graduate education, now there's this sort of emphasis on this ethic within the classroom. The idea of inclusion, which we've of course seen uh, increase in the past few years, at least in a structured manner, with the rise of DEI initiatives. Um, so thank you all for participating in that and for sharing your thoughts. As you can see, a lot of what you thought of when it came to ethics is already reflected in what we understand as ethics in the classroom to already be. Um, so now let me come to why are we even having this conversation about AI, right? Like I could have just not spoken about AI and spoken about just ethics in the classroom. But unfortunately, there's this like huge, fortunately or unfortunately, there's this huge boom going on. It's like a technological boom, but specifically for artificial intelligence. So you all are already aware of Gemini, ChatGPT, Copilot, Perplexity, Sora. All of these are tools which have now emerged, a lot of which students are already using in classrooms to help with their assignments and other things, right? Now, the interesting thing is that this AI boom is not, the boom is recent, but AI in itself is not as recent in the classroom as we think it is. So the use of Canvas and Turnitin, for example, which we've been doing for several years now, has always included that element of artificial intelligence and data scraping from multiple sources across the internet, right? So it's something that now we're being confronted with because there are so many more that are sort of in our face and that we need to respond to almost as educators. And the problem sort of emerges is because the future generation of learners is using these tools as a learning guide, which is almost what our responsibility as educators was to act as that process guide for students, to take them through the process of learning, to help them understand how to reach outcomes. But now that entire process phase has sort of been taken over by some of these AI assistants, right? And I think that's part of the reason why, like, some of us might feel threatened, for example, by the very presence of AI in the classroom. Um, it's very tough to ignore this because it's all around us. Everyone's talking about it, right? You go to any social media platform, we're talking about AI. It's very tough to ignore, but it's also just as imperative for us to acknowledge it out loud, such that we can actually regulate it in a particular way that we want it to function within academia or within the education sphere, right? So it's the regulation topic, which is what we need to focus on. But before we can even talk about regulation, there needs to be acknowledgement within the classroom. So students are often sort of coming in not knowing whether they're allowed to use it because there's no clarity on whether they're allowed to use it. And so we're going to talk about some of the effective strategies once we go a little deeper into the implications of AI. According to a 2024 report by DEC, 86% of students globally are regularly using AI. I don't think I would take this number at face value because this probably has a lot to do with sampling and who they sampled, etc. Um, and 54% of them they found within their sample was using AI on a weekly basis, right? So the use of AI in itself is not within our control, but what is within our control is the classroom spaces and how we sort of guide students to use these tools that exist around them. And so there are these three key questions which I think emerge when we think about AI in the classroom. And I'm going to give you maybe a minute or two to just reflect on these. And if you have any thoughts, to share them in the chat box. But are we as educators to use AI as an aid for our own course design, for the way our Canvas is hosted, for the way we manage grades and attendance, etc.? The second question is, are we as educators responsible for managing student use of AI? Right? So, for example, recently in a classroom that I was in, I heard a conversation where they were like, we don't need to be told what we can or not use, right? Especially when you're talking about the graduate sphere of education. So these are just some things to keep in mind. Like, can we actually regulate student use of AI in that sense? And how would you justify that decision? And the third question is, are we as educators responsible for devising an AI policy for our classrooms? Is there something that we need to do in terms of acknowledgement and clear communications to students such that they can also proceed with caution? Um, and how should we go about that process? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about this, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts if you'd like to share. We have from Brock in the chat. Most usage is very much limited to the tasks we are asking them to perform. AI offers us a means of tools that we must learn to use and judgment in usage. Students I've surveyed use it like Wikipedia and for sentence construction, which is not the usage employers look for. Thank you very much for sharing, bro. So yeah, just to be clear, I don't have an answer to these questions, right? So I'm just as much of in an dilemma as an educator myself about, can I truly be responsible for managing how students use it? And how do I sort of guide that use, misuse, or lack of use of AI? There are some students who are very uncomfortable with the idea of AI, right? And with being asked to use AI for an assessment, for an assignment, or any kind of um, sort of learning modality. And I mean, I don't think any student should be forced to use a particular thing either, uh, right? Especially because AI at this time brings about this sort of incredible amount of uncertainty, which is almost, I don't think it's similar, but there are parallels that are drawn from when the internet came about and sort of how individuals responded to that, even educators. And there are parallels being made about how our responses to AI are almost similar because we're not sure about how to deal with it. From Elizabeth in the chat, I think educators have enough to do and consider and cannot also take on the added responsibility of policing AI usage. I also think AI is the future and conversations about it should focus on responsible use rather than on regulating or controlling its use. Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing, Elizabeth. I agree. I do agree. I think that there's more than enough for educators to do already. The educators are sort of overburdened, which is more of a systemic problem, um, not something which the students are responsible for per se. Um, and I agree, it should be on responsible use, but I think there are some key considerations to take into account, and some of those questions which I'm going to ask as we move forward. Yes, Randall, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I've been involved for uh, about 3 years now. I don't know. I think ChatGPT came out in late 22, and I've been working with AI for many years, and I'm an old guy. I took a class from Dr. Clickguard and Dr. Shabtai. They kind of are cutting edge in AI use, and also I've been working with Dr. Weekly in the writing center because I'm in the dissertation writing class, and we are always negotiating. Like I'll go to them and say, I'm going to use my AI and this is what I'm going to do with it. How do you feel about that? So, because I'm pushing the boundaries a lot. And in fact, in my consulting, because I'm a full-time business consultant, we are already like, the new recent month ago, Claude bot turned into OpenClaw. We've already incorporated recursive self improvement into our models. At this point, I gave it a task to look at 200 different sources that I'm evaluating for my dissertation. And I said, which of these, here's my criteria, which of these are most applicable and which ones just really don't cut it, so that I didn't have to go and read every one. And within, 15 minutes, it culled it out for me. And so my advisor has not had a problem with me doing those kinds of things where it's just a laborious procedural task uh, that I can offload to automate. But where it starts to get into the gray area is how much writing is the AI doing, because their writing skills just keep getting better and better. And I personally don't feel comfortable about just telling it to, generate a chapter for my dissertation. I just don't think that's appropriate. But I'm definitely using it as a mentor. I write up something. I said, hey, argue, a counterpoint, and I use it to really challenge me to make sure that the work that I produce is of high quality. By the time I'm ready to do my dissertation, um, whatever you call it, where you got to argue it in front of the committee, I literally could have an avatar of me that would argue my dissertation better than I could argue it. So it's getting a little crazy, and I'm taking a lot of time. But let me just say one, because I'm an older guy. Um, I have approached like Dr. Clickard and said, what we're missing as far as developing a CGU policy is that when I was in high school, we used a slide rule for our mathematical calculations. Most people don't even know what that is. And then the electronic calculator, like my junior year of high school, came out, and immediately you can't use the calculator for your homework. Well, obviously, eventually, calculators became very sophisticated, and so the curriculum was rewritten that required the use of a calculator because the problems were much more difficult. And where I think we're headed with this kind of AI and research is the expectation for what I should be able to deliver in my dissertation should be at an order of magnitude, a much higher level of deep thought and making connections and arguing, so that the AI is really a partner in developing it. And that's what I proposed to them, is that, here was my outline for my dissertation, but now I can do so much more. I can go much deeper, and I want to actually use AI and really get into making some arguments that I would have never thought of. And we're kind of working it back and forth, but at least the most important thing is I'm very transparent. I let them know everything that I'm doing. And then at some point, they're okay or they're not okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Randall. I really appreciate, I mean, you bringing in all your expertise and how you've been using it in the recent past. I think there's definitely something to be said about responsible implementation, and you highlight some of the boundary conditions that we need, like you shouldn't be writing an entire chapter, for example, using a particular tool like that. Um, I think it's interesting because if we are so skeptical of our own use in terms of like, am I doing the right thing by using it in this way? Um, then it's a lot to also put onto students to think of that by themselves at the age of 18, at the age of 19, or sometimes even younger, to make those decisions for themselves. Um, and I think just based on what I'm reading in the chat as well, there's there was something about resistance and how if an educator resists the use of AI, it can create uh, some more sort of polarization and confusion for students. And that's where I think institutions need to come in. Like, it's very important for institutions to have a clear stand on something like the use of AI or non-use of AI. And for those who believe that like regulation is not as important, but responsible use, again, I believe that that's something that needs to come at the institutional level rather than at the educator level. Because if we do it at the educator level, then the same issues are going to emerge in terms of the subjectivity of AI use, right? For example, I am one of those people, I think, who is resistant to the use of AI in the classroom. I think it does not align with why students become students in the first place. Why do you come to college in the first place, right? These are some other considerations that we're going to speak about as well. But thank you all for sharing. I'm going to give Brock a chance to speak, and then I'm going to move on.
So in re so I'm here as an adjunct. I'm I have my own startup. I've been working in industry for about 15 years. My PhD is in psychology. My postdoc is in computer software as well as behavioral neuroscience. My class is Psychology 350 UA, and it's designing with and for AI. I think one of the things, and a lot of my background is in designing curriculum, and I was a public school teacher for over 10 years. And what I found is that oftentimes the reason why we are so out of step with technology and students is because our curriculum is 50 years behind. So when you tell me that you do not want to write with AI, what I challenge you to do is say, what is good writing? So for example, an article I'm preparing right now is How to Write Like Brock. And what I did is I took the cognitive analysis from John Borman, one of Herbert Simon's students, and I said, what are the cognitive frameworks for writing? Is it just syntax? Is it grammar? Is it word choice? How does it work? And how is it that I want to perform my own language? And this comes from my experience with middle school students, teaching them how to read and get across their reading comprehensions. And my experience in those classes to reinforce why I suggest this is my students went up 2 cut scores. And my students were North Minneapolis students, 99% free and reduced lunch, 1% not reporting. These are the kids who are not supposed to be able to read. Why is it that they learned how to read? We began to create experiences in which they could connect the concepts so that when they saw them again, they had personal experience rather than trying to connect one word to define another. Now I'll go back to my issue about writing. If we begin to say, how is it that you want to write? How should the prosody of that language come out when I speak it? What should it look like when it's on paper? And how should that exist? Well, if anybody is interested, one of the things in the class that we're going to do is say, how do you write like me? And then to teach through scripting how the AI should write like me by deciding what my voice should be grammatically, syntactically, with word choice and prosody. So for example, if I say, I would like my writing to be grounded in experience, I would then like to offer a lens through which to view the experience, and then I would like an analysis so that the reader has both the experience, the concept, and the connection. I would like my writing to be at an 8th grade level, just like Congressional Quarterly, what our Congress people read, so that it's accessible to more people. I would like my word frequency to be thus. And we begin making those choices and scripting those. We begin to, through experience, understand what writing, language, communication, and voice are, rather than saying, study this, apply it to your work. This is a complete curriculum revolution where we're asking them to take the things that we're trying to teach them and utilize them in a way that is meaningful. And that means that using AI is a very different approach in the classroom than what we've typically done. One of the first things that I find with my students is that they don't even know how to set it up. And I'll bet you nobody here does either. Has anybody ever set up Cursor on their desktop? Has anybody coded with Cursor? Has anybody used Figma Make? these are all the things that kids are going to be expected to know. And I know from having just been accessed from Amazon and the speakers that I have coming into my course. The thing that we're beginning to see is that we're not being replaced by AI, we're being replaced by people who can use it. And most people don't know how to use it. They're still using it like Wikipedia. They're still using it like Google. And it's a very different tool. Now with agents and orchestrations, what it does is tool calling. So what we thought was just token prediction, that's not it anymore. And I'm also the founder of a medical health company, and I use AI within my business, and I have 2 patents. If anybody here is interested in learning more about this, I have a curriculum that's offered at 350 UA. Please talk to my students. They're wonderful, smart students. See what they're learning. And I'll tell you what, when I started this class, I had 30 students. When I showed the first assignment, I had 8. And one of the reasons is they are not used to this kind of learning. They don't like ill-formed problems. They want very much the clarity on how to get an A, and getting an A is very important. And what I've been trying to get across to them is I said, nobody's going to look at your grade when you graduate, when you apply for a job. What they're going to look at is whether or not Brock wrote you a reference and connected you to his professional network in order to get a job. And they say, that's true. And I say, so what would you do if you were guaranteed an A? Would you truly engage with the curriculum? How would you use it to better yourself and move towards your goals? And that's a very different approach to curriculum than the structure that we have within the university system. And that's why my first response was structure. And the key here is don't ask whether or not a system will lie to you. Ask if it can afford not to. Most people won't stand up and push back truth against power. Secondly, most people don't have the energy to push back. When I worked at Walmart, we watched a $7 million project get greenlit, and we knew it was never going to work because all the core assumptions were wrong. And fail it did. Did anybody step forward? No, because nobody had the political or the professional clout to weather that type of criticism that came from being somebody who spoke truth to power. So we're in a system.
Thank you very much, Brock. I really appreciate what you said about, again, about how you're using AI and how you see the future of it, in terms of everyone knowing how to use it the same, which sort of brings me to this next section where we sort of should get real in terms of what the negative impacts of AI are. There's a lot that happens beyond the bubbles that we speak in and operate in, like this room, for example, I mean, no offense in that sense, but like there are certain threats to education that are emerging, and there are much broader threats even beyond education that we need to consider, which I'll be talking about. So here's are some thoughts of Diane Ravitch, who's an educational historian, very well known. She's sort of been at the forefront of this idea of what the threats posed to education are by AI and what we need to keep in consideration. And the first question is perhaps the most obvious for those of us that believe that the classroom space in educational spheres should be free of for-profit institutions. That's no longer a reality with the commercialization of AI and AI mostly being a privatized tool, especially in terms of the companies that we've been using and that have become so big. And the question emerges that are you comfortable with the use of for-profit organizations or institutions within the classroom? Does that go against the fundamental ethic of education in the first place? I know we do have for-profit institutions either way, but this is sort of an additional load of commercialization, which does align with sort of the capitalistic ideas in certain parts of the world, but not so much in others. Um, and then the next question is something, again, we've highlighted quite a bit, both in the chat and in some of the responses that we've heard, which is the idea of regulation and accountability. Who do you ask for what the right way to do things is? Are you determining what the right use of things is? And how do we correct the actual misuse of this AI? For example, digital data privacy is something we're going to talk about, right? Like, I recently read an article about a for-profit private organization that was pulled into a government setup for facial recognition. And today that government is in court against that organization because they claim that all the data in terms of facial recognition of that country belongs to the private organization itself, right? And this creates a lot of problem because it's uh, classified data. Firstly, it's government level data, it's nation level data. No private organization should hold that data, at least in the ethic, in terms of if you were to think of it ethically. And then who holds the data, right? Even in terms of students, in terms of presentations that students are making, who is controlling all this data about these students, about these educators? Um, and there's also this erosion of educational values. I saw in the chat something about how critical thinking should not be replaced, as critical thinking is one of the core facets of education, be it undergraduate education, graduate education. Um, so critical thinking is almost being replaced into this idea of critical prompt writing, almost. And so there is this fear of erosion of educational values, which is not felt just by the students, but also by several educators. Um, and also in the past, we've seen, of course, models become better with time, LLMs. Um, but there has been the creation of knowledge that doesn't actually exist. I, for example, myself have experienced false citations being created to articles that don't exist at all, right? And this can be a big problem because it's misrepresentation of historical findings within our fields, whichever field we specialize in. And as a result, from that misuse or that misguided understanding and interpretation, it's going to affect the future outcomes related to that as well. And that's why Dr. Diane Ravitch says that you should use AI as a tool, but not as a panacea. And not to sort of overemphasize its use, but to be more careful in the way that you actually go about using it. Now let's move a little beyond this idea of education, just general ill consequences. So the West has this historical tendency of being at the forefront of technological advances, but that often comes at the cost of exporting the ill consequences or the negative consequences of these things onto other countries that are still developing, right? I'm from India. India is a country that's faced that historically quite a few times. I believe we're facing it yet again. India has recently, in its budget session, announced tax breaks to any foreign organization that wants to set up a data center in India till 2047. Just to put things into context, India has 20% of the world population, but 4% of the water resources that exist in the world. And these data centers, as you all are already aware with things you must have read, they're highly water intensive. There's an S&P global study that came out last year that's saying that within the decade, India is going to face 80% water shortage to supply enough water to cool down these data centers, which is again showing you why it's not a clear-cut problem and it's not people make claims like it's here to stay and it's going to stay here indefinitely. The kind of reliance that our data centers and AI infrastructure has on natural resources presently, it's not as sustainable as we might think it is in that sense. Just to give you another example, um, the average cloud storage that we use, like Google Drive, OneDrive, or any other thing that we use, a mid-sized data center like that has uses enough electricity that could power around 20,000 homes. Right. So this is from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, a resource which I would encourage you to look at in terms of what the repercussions of the AI boom would be and what that would look like if we did it in education. Education is a huge industry, as of course we all know. And then there are depleting cognitive and reasoning skills. We spoke about critical thinking a bit. More importantly, in terms of realistic threats, there's rising unemployment in labor-intensive industries, which is a big problem because this is going to actually increase the income disparity in society. As educators, it's our responsibility to think beyond the binary of what AI will look like if we use it or not use it, and think beyond in terms of the broader consequences and sort of effects that it has on the world around us. And then, like I mentioned, the misuse of data, who actually handles the data, and we're no longer in control of this data. So I wanted to bring up this study that came out in this journal article where they collected data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis to see how AI exposure rate, which is on your x-axis, which goes from 10% to 80%, how that affects unemployment. So you can see some of the industries in general, which are more ill affected because of the rise in AI in terms of unemployment, management, computer and math, things like architecture and engineering, which were earlier pretty labor intensive in some ways, arts, entertainment, and sports. it was interesting to me to see education be so low, which perhaps means that we still aren't ready to accept it and freely use it, which I think is a good thing because the slower we take it, the better I believe that we'll be able to implement the use of AI within our classrooms. So just to highlight again, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, they had this report that came out in 2025 in October, which I encourage you to check out. It's called Data Drain, the Land and Water Impacts of the AI Boom. Um, this is just a quote that I picked up from there, from that particular article. That may sound hyperbolic, but data centers truly are resource ravenous. Even a mid-sized data center consumes as much water as a small town, while larger ones require up to 5 million gallons of water every day, as much as a city of 50,000 people. Um, right? So it's not, I mean, there's something that we need to sort of reflect on as users of AI and as educators if we want to use AI in the classroom about does it truly go against the entire ethos of what it means to be in a classroom? If you believe that your classroom is a space where ethics of care and justice and things like that are practiced, which education has historically, then we need to sort of bring this to the forefront as well and let students make an informed choice about whether they think it's the right way to move forward or not. And I'm going to move into the effective sort of teaching strategies once we go over some of the benefits of AI. So some of you already highlighted and are pretty passionate about the use of AI. Um, it personalizes learning, which is something that historically we've struggled with in terms of the sheer number of things. For example, in highly populated countries, it's not possible to personalize learning really without the use of some technological tool. So AI in that sense has proven to be an opportunity, the use of certain tools. You can reduce the time taken on less prioritized tasks. Like we heard someone mention about how it's just regular sort of rat work which you're getting AI to do. And people believe that this frees up some mental energy for them for other challenges. Um, and then I think the other benefit is that things are changing really fast and we need to sort of keep up with that change. So maybe we should consider its responsible use. I'm going to show us a brief 6 to 7 minute video um, by Sal Khan, who's the same person who started Khan Academy. Um, just a second. Can you all see the screen?
Yep.
Thank you.
So, anyone who's been paying attention for the last few months has been seeing headlines like this, especially in education. The thesis has been students are going to be using ChatGPT and other forms of AI to cheat, do their assignments, they're not going to learn, and it's going to completely undermine education as we know it. Now, what I'm going to argue today is not only are there ways to mitigate all of that, if we put the right guardrails, we do the right things, we can mitigate it. But I think we're at the cusp of using AI for probably the biggest positive transformation that education has ever seen. And the way we're going to do that is by giving every student on the planet an artificially intelligent but amazing personal tutor. And we're going to give every teacher on the planet an amazing artificially intelligent teaching assistant. And just to appreciate how big of a deal it would be to give everyone a personal tutor, I show you this clip from Benjamin Bloom's 1984 Two Sigma study, where he called it the Two Sigma problem. The two sigma comes from two standard deviations, sigma the symbol for standard deviation. And he had good data that showed that, look, in a normal distribution, that's the one that you see in the traditional bell curve right in the middle. That's how the world kind of sorts itself out. That if you were to give personal one-to-one tutoring for students, then you can actually get a distribution that looks like that right. It says tutorial one-to-one with the asterisk, like that right distribution, a two standard deviation improvement. Just to put that in plain language, that could take your average student and turn them into an exceptional student. It can take your below average student and turn them into an above average student. Now, the reason why he framed it as a problem was he said, well, this is all good, but how do you actually scale group instruction this way? How do you actually give it to everyone in an economic way? What I'm about to show you is, I think, the first moves towards doing that. Obviously, we've been trying to approximate it in some way at Khan Academy for over a decade now, but I think we're at the cusp of accelerating it dramatically. I'm going to show you the early stages of what our AI, which we call Khanmigo, what it can now do, and maybe a little bit of where it is actually going. So this right over here is a traditional exercise that you or many of your children might have seen on Khan Academy. But what's new is that little bot thing at the right. And we'll start by seeing one of the very important safeguards, which is the conversation is recorded and viewable by your teacher. It's moderated actually by a second AI. And also, it does not tell you the answer. It is not a cheating tool. Notice, when the student says, tell me the answer, it says, I'm your tutor. What do you think is the next step for solving the problem? Now, if the student makes a mistake, and this will surprise people who think large language models are not good at mathematics, notice not only does it notice the mistake, it asks the student to explain their reasoning, but it's actually doing what I would say not just even an average tutor would do, but an excellent tutor would do. It's able to divine what is probably the misconception in that student's mind, that they probably didn't use the distributive properly. Remember, we need to distribute the -2 to both the 9 and the 2m inside of the parentheses. This to me is a very, very, very big deal. And it's not just in math. This is a computer programming exercise on Khan Academy where the student needs to make the clouds part. And so we can see the student starts defining a variable, left x minus minus. It only made the left cloud part, but then they can ask Khanmigo, what's going on? Why is only the left cloud moving? And it understands the code. It knows all the context of what the student is doing. And it understands that those ellipses are there to draw clouds, which I think is kind of mind-blowing. And it says, to make the right cloud move as well, try adding a line of code inside the draw function that increments the right x variable by 1 pixel in each frame. Now, this one is maybe even more amazing because we have a lot of math teachers. We've all been trying to teach the world to code, but there aren't a lot of computing teachers out there. And what you just saw, even when I'm tutoring my kids when they're learning to code, I can't help them this well, this fast. This is
Thank you for just watching that. So the way that we've discussed things so far has sort of been, we discussed sort of the ill consequences and the negative effects and implications of AI. This was more of a brief how it can be used positively and what other educators in the field feel. But now I want to sort of move on to this idea of what are some effective strategies that we can actually do in the workplace, right? A lot of ideas about we should do this and we should do that, and like we don't have the right to do this. What can we actually do in the classroom? So for the first tool, that is my recommendation, and also it's something that's already being used in several classrooms, is this idea of developing a collaborative AI policy. Just the fact this obviously firstly only works better in smaller classrooms. It's very important, as I've been sort of mentioning throughout, to acknowledge the power and uncertainty that's presented by AI. It's new for everyone. Whether you're excited by it or not, there is still some element of uncertainty associated with it, right? And developing a collaborative AI policy would ensure that every student gets to at least express what they feel about the use of AI within the classroom. For those of you that feel that this might be too like time consuming as educators, this can also be something that's asynchronous. You don't actually need to be involved as much. You need to collate responses and then sort of develop your own AI policy based on student responses. And of course, what this does is it ensures diversity of perspective. So this will include students who are extremely passionate about AI use and think that that's the future of everything. But there may be other that are skeptics because they know more about like the ill consequences of it in a particular context, and maybe that affects them. What this also does is it allows for peer critique of policies. So you can actually get feedback on your contributions to the AI policy document. And I think that that's really helpful because students in conversations with themselves will often figure out what they want much better than a student would do with an educator, for example. And we already know that about peer mentoring and things like that. So this allowing for peer critique is definitely a way to develop a robust collaborative AI policy. The second thing is what this entire webinar was about. It's about like integrating the idea of ethics into the AI discussion. I don't think personally that use should be mandatory because that goes against a lot of things that we already promise that we're doing within the classroom. So it should remain optional, or there should be some clarity on whether it's allowed at all or not allowed at all or whatever. There needs to be conversations about equity mindedness. Someone already pointed out that some students know how to use it and others don't. And I can promise you that there are probably other structural disadvantages that would emerge if you were to delve deeper into why that gap is so high in terms of usage. Right? So we need to be a little more practical in terms of the biases that already exist in society. It's very, very easy to reinforce those same biases with the use of AI, whether it's in terms of access, whether it's in terms of learning, or whatever. And then again, this is something that's completely optional, but if you have a justice orientation towards education and why you're an educator, then that should be integrated into the conversation of AI as well, about how can you actually use it in that way, or even if is that even a possibility in the first place. Here are two other sort of strategies that I'd like to leave you with before I conclude and then maybe open the floor for a few minutes if we still have time. Maybe we can reframe the question as educators, right? It's not about is the ethical use of AI possible. It's about what are the antecedents or what are the factors within your classroom or what are the assumptions about your classroom that need to be true for the ethical use of AI to be possible, right? So the ethical use of AI is actually very context dependent, is what this reframed question is trying to say. Um, it's trying to say that we need things like equality and equity and justice already in place within the classroom in order for there to be any kind of ethical use of AI. Otherwise, there will always, almost always, be some kind of misuse or misinterpretation of findings associated with these large language models. And I think that that's a fascinating question to ask, and it's a conversation we've had a lot at Cafe as well, about what we as educators can do to make those assumptions true about our classrooms so that the use of modern technology can be beneficial rather than inhibiting. Um, and then my fourth sort of recommendation is that I think we sort of need to go back to the basics a bit, right? Why do students come to university in the first place? Are they coming to get a perfect writing answer, to communicate perfectly, to get 100% on that grade? I'm not sure. For some students, that might be true. So it's important that we have the conversation of whether the use of those large language models or whatever you want to call them, whether the students' use of that aligns with their overall goals of being a student in the first place. If your goal of being a student is to be able to ask questions by yourself, come up with ideas by yourself, then perhaps the use of AI might not be justified for that student. So it's important that you be transparent about this entire process. This conversation about AI also needs to be ongoing. It can't be a one-time thing. I know there's this sense of we're already burdened. Um, yeah, unfortunately, I feel like we're going to be burdened more with the introduction of AI, whether we want it or not want it, because it is our responsibility to determine how that fares in our classrooms. Um, and yeah, and then I think there needs to be some time for students to reflect on the way that they've already used it or haven't used it or want to use it. Let them for themselves, the idea of what was it, recursive feedback loop, let them recursively feedback loop themselves, let them get an idea of what worked for them and what didn't work for them. So these are just four sort of effective strategies that I want to leave you with. And then in conclusion, to sum up everything that we've spoken about, it's essential for us to acknowledge the challenge, the uncertainty, but also the opportunity that it presents, right? There are technological advancements already being made that we could not have imagined. Um, there's been medical breakthroughs, which will probably take a time before it actually comes out for public use, but there have been medical breakthroughs. It's important for us to just be okay with the discomfort that this conversation causes. There's no one way to be right or one way to be wrong. We can keep having that conversation, but there's just not one right way. So it's important that we're open to facing questions and criticisms. If you think this is an uncertain time for you, it's at least 100 times more uncertain for the students. Keep that in mind and sort of remember that we as educators exist because students exist and not the other way around. Dependence on AI should be discouraged. I believe I can make that as a sort of blanket statement, because dependence is when actually it becomes a problem, because you lose critical thinking skills, you're no longer even engaged with what's going on. And then, like we discussed in terms of what can we do about it, we should discuss student opinion on the matter, hear what students have to say if you can take out that time, generate a collaborative AI policy, work together, co-create that policy, and most importantly, let the conversation continue. Don't say that we've had this conversation and we're not going to talk about this again. Right? That's not a nice thing that you could do, especially when students are still trying to figure out how they feel about this. And then I think it's one of the most important things is communication. It's essential for you to communicate your stand as an educator early on about what use looks like for you. And broadly, I think there's also an institutional responsibility for institutions to say that we will be using it like this or not using it like this, because it's important to create that clarity in the minds of students. Thank you all for listening. My name is Akshay Sharan, and I'm a CAFE fellow, and I really enjoyed this. Thank you for your participation. If you have any questions, please